About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the forms of houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally, a line of gray cars crawls along an invisible track and comes to rest, gives out a ghastly creak. And immediately, ash-gray men with leaden spades. Ash-gray men with leaden spades. Ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud, which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust that drift endlessly over it, you perceive, after a moment, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high, and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then sank down himself into eternal blindness, or else forgot them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and passengers on the waiting. And when the drawbridge is up to let barges through, passengers on the waiting train can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he turned up in popular cafes and, leaving her at a table, sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Though I was curious to see her, I did not want to meet her, but I did. When I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, as we stopped by the ash heaps, he, jumping to his feet, took hold of my elbow. "We're getting off," he said. "I want you to meet my girl." I want you to meet my girl. I think he'd tanked up a good bit at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. So you can see there's a cat there. I followed him over a low whitewashed railroad fence and back along the road 100 yards under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small square of yellow brick. A small square of yellow brick sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it, and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the buildings it contained was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, slapping him jovially slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" I can't complain, said Wilson unconvincingly. When are you going to sell me that car? Next week. I've got my man working on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he? No, he doesn't, said Tom coldly. And if you feel that way about it, maybe I better sell it somewhere else after all. I didn't mean that, said Wilson hurriedly. I just meant that. His voice faded off. Tom glanced impatiently about the garage. Then I heard footsteps on a stairs, and in a minute the thickish figure of a woman appeared in the doorway of the office. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. There was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and, without turning, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. Get some chairs, why don't you, so someone can sit down. Oh, sure, agreed Wilson, hurrying off in the direction of the office, mingling immediately with the cement color of the walls. A white ashen dust veiled his dark suit and his paled hair, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. I want to see you, he said. Get on the next train. All right. We'll meet you at the newsstand on the lower level. She nodded and moved away from Tom just as George Wilson emerged from the office carrying 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and a gray, scrawny Italian child was setting torpedoes in a row along the railroad. Terrible place, isn't it? Said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson? He thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive. And so, Tom Buchanan, his mistress, and I took the train together up to New York. We're not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in another car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers that might have been on the train. She had changed her dress to a brown figured muslin, which stretched wide, which clung to her tight hips, her rather wide hips, as Tom helped her down to the platform in New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and a moving pictures magazine, and at the drugstore, she bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume. Upstairs, in the solemn echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs drive away before selecting a new one, gray in color with a lavender interior. And in this we slid out from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, she turned sharply from the window and tapped on the front glass. I want to get one of those dogs, she said, earnestly. They're a nice thing to have, for the apartment. They're a nice thing to have, a dog. We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller, and in a basket, swung from his neck, cowered a dozen or so very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. What kind are they? All kinds. What kind do you want, lady? I'd like to get one of those police dogs. I'd like to get one of those police dogs, said Mrs. Wilson eagerly. I don't suppose you got that kind. The man peered doubtfully into his basket and plunged in a hand and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. That's no police dog, said Tom. It's not exactly a police dog, said the man with disappointment in his voice. It's more of an Airedale. Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold. I think it's cute, said Mrs. Wilson eagerly. Enthusiastically. Shit. How much is it? That dog will cost you $10. You must have. I think it's cute, said Mrs. Wilson enthusiastically. How much is it? It's $10. The Airedale. Certainly there was some Airedale mixed up in there somewhere, though its paws were startlingly white, changed hands and settled down into Mrs. Wilson's lap where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked delicately. That dog? It's a boy. It's a bitch, said Tom. Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it. We drove on over to Fifth Avenue, warm and soft, almost pastoral on a summer Sunday afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a flock of white sheep turn the corner. I've got to leave you here, I said. No, you don't. Hold on, I said. I've got to leave you here. No, you don't. Tom interposed quickly. Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you, Myrtle? Come on, she urged. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know. We went on, cutting back over the park towards the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, we stopped at one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up the dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. The apartment was on the top floor. As we rose in the I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course I've got to telephone my sister too. Or call my sister too. The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small bedroom, a small dining room, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the door with furniture, tapestried furniture much too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. On the coffee table, there was a copy of Simon Called Peter and the Broadway Scandal sheets, and a single picture hung on the wall. What appeared to be a hen sitting on a rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady peered down into the room. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy was dispatched for a box of straw and some milk, to which he added of his own initiative a tin of large hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decomposing apathetically in a saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from behind a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon, so everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, even though, until after 8 o'clock, the apartment was full of bright sunshine. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson made several phone calls. Then there were no cigarettes, so I went out to the corner drugs. I went out to buy some from the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had both disappeared. So I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either the whiskey had distorted things, or it was terrible stuff, because either it was terrible stuff, or the whiskey had distorted things, because I couldn't make any sense of it. When they re-emerged, when Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature towards the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking due to innumerable pottery bracelets that jangled up and down her arm. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked so possessively at the furniture, I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, however, she repeated the question aloud, laughed immoderately, and said she lived in an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a spot of white lather on his cheek, and he was most polite in his greetings to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I deduced later it was he who had taken the enlarged photograph of Mrs. Wilson's mother that hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She informed us with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they'd been married. I think these fellows will cheat you every time. Mrs. Wilson had changed her dress again, and with a change of costume came a change of attitude. Gone was the impressive vitality from the garage, and in its place was an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures grew bigger, more wild as the night went on, until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy creaking pivot through the smoky air. These fellows are only after one thing, she yelled to her sister in a high mincing shout. All they think of is money. They'll cheat you. These fellows will cheat you every time, she yelled to her sister in a high mincing shout. All they think of is money. They're only after one thing. All they think of is money. Something like that. I had a woman up here to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you'd think she'd had my appendicitis out. What was her name? Asked Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Eberhardt. She goes around looking at people's feet in their homes. Looking at people's feet in their homes. I like you in that dress, said Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. This thing This crazy old thing, it's just something I throw on when I don't care what I look like. But I think it's cute, said Mrs. McKee. If Chester could get you in that pose, I think he could really make something of it. We all looked at Mrs. Wilson in silence. As she removed a strand of hair from over her eye. I think that's where I'm at. Let me do a book check. Looked so obsessively at the furniture, I wondered if she lived there. On his body, he was in the artistic game, he was a photographer, and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. Miss Wilson changed her costume some time before, now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave it a continual rustle as she swept about the room. Influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently effective moment by moment. As she expanded, the room grew smaller. Noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. My dear, she told her sister in a high, mincing shout. So she told her sister in a high, mincing shout. Most of these fellows will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. Feet, Eberhardt. Like your dress, remarked Miss McKee. I think it's adorable. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. I knew the word disdain was in there. Just a crazy old thing. I slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like, but it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean, pursued Miss McKee. I knew there was some specific word there. If Chester could only get you in that pose, he could make something of it. We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eye and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. I knew there was something in that, too, about how she looked back at them, and I suspected it was with a smile. So that's where I'm at. I've not made any forward progress, and I'm barely doing any maintenance on this. Be in the light or out of the light, sir. I've been working on this project for like at least 2 years, if not 3, and as the amount that I'm supposed to have memorized keeps getting longer and longer, it becomes just harder and harder to maintain what I have and to not do anything to make any forward progress. But I should return to, one, because I'm working again, have a little more distraction-free time. Because memorizing Gatsby was a good thing to do at work. You know, you have 2 or 3 minutes of downtime, and you're just trying to remember the sentence that you wrote down that morning. And that was how I was making a lot of good forward progress. So yeah, that's what I'm up to. And hopefully there aren't a million videos of me just doing the first 4 pages of chapter 2 and getting to the same point over and over and over again. Okay, bye.